The cops showed up before dessert was served, which was impressive, considering they had to drive past 3 separate gates with my name stamped on them in bronze. I was halfway through pouring a bottle of 2011 Merlot for a table of guests when I saw the red and blue lights bouncing off the oak barrels stacked near the barn. For a second, I thought some drunk had crashed into the irrigation ditch again. Then I noticed the sheriff's deputy climbing out of his cruiser with the kind of look you were when you've been dragged somewhere you'd rather not be. Apparently, the HOA thought it was a good idea to call the cops on my private vineyard party. Yes, my vineyard. Not the clubhouse lawn, not some rented pavilion, not even a shared poolside cabana. My land, my grapes, my wine, my valley. To understand how ridiculous that was, picture this. I had invited about 70 people, neighbors, a few business partners, and some family, to a casual evening under the stars. Nothing wild. Strings of lights over the trellis, music drifting from a live acoustic duo, kids running between the vines, and tables lined with local cheeses and bread. The loudest thing happening was a cork popping now and then. But the HOA president, whom I'll call Cynthia, decided it was a disturbance to the peace. The deputy walked up stiff, adjusting his belt as though bracing for war. "Sir, we got a noise complaint. Says there's an unauthorized gathering violating neighborhood guidelines." I smiled, because you learn early on in vineyard business that smiles win wars. "Deputy, I'd love to see the guidelines that claim an HOA can regulate a man's private valley." Before he could answer, Cynthia came hustling through the rows of vines like she'd personally caught Al Capone. Her high heels sank into the dirt with every furious step. "Officer, arrest him. This is against the bylaws. He can't just throw parties without approval." The deputy sighed the way a man sighs when he's being asked to arrest someone for enjoying wine on his own porch. He looked at me, then at Cynthia. "Ma'am, this isn't exactly subdivision common ground. This is his vineyard." Cynthia squared her shoulders. "He may own the dirt, but the HOA governs the community surrounding it, and gatherings larger than 25 require board approval." It would have been funny if she weren't dead serious. People nearby had stopped mid-bite, watching like it was free entertainment. One guest muttered, "This is better than the band." I leaned against a barrel and raised my glass. "Deputy, maybe you should explain to her why I'm not subject to her bylaws." The man chuckled. "Because, ma'am, the county records list him as owner of all 312 acres. This isn't a cul-de-sac barbecue. This is his land, start to finish." The silence that followed was sweeter than the Pinot. Cynthia's face twitched, then rearranged into outrage. "That doesn't matter. His parties attract outsiders, and that affects property values. Noise travels. People see cars lined up. It changes the atmosphere of the neighborhood." It was one of those moments where you realize logic won't help. So I just nodded slowly. Yes, the dangerous sight of parked cars. Truly, civilization is ending. Laughter rippled through the tables. Cynthia turned scarlet, waving her hands. "This is not a joke. You're undermining the standards of our community." The deputy scratched his head. "Ma'am, unless you want to file a personal noise complaint, which won't go far since the sound meter wouldn't crack 70 decibels, I'd recommend heading home." But Cynthia wasn't finished. She jabbed a manicured finger toward me. "This is not over. You think you're untouchable just because you own a vineyard? The HOA has rules, and we will enforce them." With that, she spun on her heel and stomped away, heels snapping against the gravel like gunshots. The deputy gave me a long look, half amused, half apologetic. Guess I'll head back before she tries to deputize me herself. The crowd cheered as he left, and I raised my glass again. The band picked back up, kids laughed, and the tension eased. But inside, I knew Cynthia wasn't bluffing. HOA presidents don't like losing face in front of an audience. And I had just embarrassed her in front of 70 witnesses. The first volley had been fired. The next morning, I woke up to an inbox stuffed with emails from the HOA board. Each one had a different subject line, but the same venom. unauthorized event, community disturbance, violation of guidelines. They demanded I attend an emergency board meeting that evening. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won. What could they possibly do? Find me? On land they had no jurisdiction over? It was like being threatened with detention by a school you didn't attend. So I showed up. The meeting was in the usual community center, a beige room with buzzing fluorescent lights and the faint smell of burned coffee. The board sat behind a long table like judges at a trial. Cynthia presided in the center, lips pursed tight. She opened with, "You flagrantly violated the spirit of our community agreements. We're here to discuss consequences." I folded my arms. I'm here mostly for entertainment. That set the tone. For the next hour, they listed complaints, traffic from my guests, increased noise, the possibility of unwanted visitors wandering into yards. One man claimed he saw teenagers leaving beer bottles near his fence. Another worried about strangers photographing his house. I let them vent because every good negotiation starts with the other side emptying their lungs. When they finally asked what I had to say, I leaned forward. Let me explain something simple. The land you're upset about? I own every acre you can see from this valley. Your houses are technically guests on my view. If I wanted, I could build a 10-foot wall of hedges and block your sunset. But I don't because I'm not interested in petty wars. I just want to drink my wine and let my friends enjoy it. A couple of board members shifted uncomfortably. Cynthia, however, smiled thinly. That's a nice speech. But ownership doesn't mean freedom from consequences. If you won't respect the HOA, we'll escalate. Escalate how? I asked, genuinely curious. Her smile widened. You'll see. And that's when I knew this wouldn't end with a few angry emails. Cynthia wasn't just mad about a party. She was mad about control. And she wasn't going to stop until she proved the HOA could leash me. By the time I walked out of that beige room, I realized something both ridiculous and inevitable. I was officially at war with my HOA, and they had no idea who they were up against. 3 days later, my valley looked less like a vineyard and more like the backdrop to a low-budget surveillance film. White SUVs with tinted windows kept crawling past the gates at odd hours, slowing just enough for someone in the passenger seat to scribble notes or snap photos. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind it. HOA boards don't just complain, they collect evidence. I wasn't particularly bothered. If they wanted pictures, they could have asked. I'd have happily posed in front of the vines holding a bottle like some B-list celebrity on a magazine cover. Still, I had workers, deliveries, and guests coming in and out every day. People started asking why there were strangers parked near the gates, jotting things down like court stenographers. And once a vineyard crew starts whispering, rumors grow faster than grapevines in May. By the end of the week, one of my distributors pulled me aside. Listen, I don't know what's going on, but a woman called our office saying your vineyard is under HOA investigation. Asked if we were comfortable associating with you. I didn't have to guess which woman. Cynthia had decided to go nuclear, skip petty fines, and try character assassination. Clever, in its way. A vineyard lives on reputation as much as soil. If she could make me look like the eccentric neighbor whose property was always in dispute, distributors and restaurants might hesitate. So, I called Cynthia directly. She answered with that sugary tone people use right before they stab you with paperwork. Hello. It's me, I said. If you're going to spread rumors about my business, at least be accurate. Tell people I'm a menace with excellent Merlot. She scoffed. Don't play games. The community has a right to know when someone's disruptive. Disruptive? I repeated. You mean hosting a party on my land? You know it's more than that. You're setting a precedent. If everyone ignores HOA approval, we'll have chaos. We exist to maintain standards. And yet, I said, you've never once complained when I donate cases of wine for your charity auctions. Interesting how standards shift depending on the recipient. That shut her up for a second. Then she snapped, this isn't about me. It's about the neighborhood. Sure, I said. So let me make this simple. Stop harassing my guests, my workers, and my distributors, or I'll bring the sheriff out again. And this time, we'll put the meeting on loudspeaker for the whole valley. Her sharp inhale was all the confirmation I needed. She was rattled, which only meant she doubled down. The escalation arrived faster than I expected. The very next Saturday, I had a small group of tourists booked for a private tasting. Just 12 people, an easy afternoon. But right as they arrived, 2 security guards in matching polos walked up the driveway, holding clipboards. Afternoon, one said, adjusting his sunglasses. We're with the HOA compliance team. We need to verify event permits and guest lists. I laughed out loud. Event permits? This isn't a stadium concert. It's 12 people drinking wine. The second guard didn't even flinch. All gatherings over 10 guests require pre-approval. Please provide documentation. The tourists froze, half in, half out of their cars, suddenly unsure if they were walking into a tasting or a sting operation. I waved them through the gate. Ignore the clowns, folks. Wine's waiting. The guards blocked the entrance. Sir, without documentation. That's when my foreman, a 6'4" ex-Marine named Luis, stepped out of the barn. He didn't say a word, just crossed his arms and looked at them like they were weeds in the wrong soil. The guards exchanged a glance, then muttered something about making a note of non-compliance and retreated to their SUV. The tourists laughed nervously, but once glasses were poured, the story turned into entertainment. Never had to pass a checkpoint for wine before, one guy joked. By the end of the afternoon, everyone was telling the HOA story like it was part of the Vineyard experience. Free marketing in its own bizarre way. But I knew the HOA wasn't done. That evening, I called Sheriff Daniels, an old friend from high school who had grown into a man permanently half amused by the absurdity of his job. Sheriff, I said, you might want to remind the HOA that their authority ends where my fence line begins. He chuckled. Heard about your compliance team. I got half the department laughing about it. Don't worry, I'll talk to them. But you know Cynthia, she won't stop until she's humiliated herself. That's the problem, I said. She doesn't mind collateral damage along the way. Sure enough, the collateral landed the following week. The HOA sent letters, not to me, but to every resident bordering my valley. The letters claimed my vineyard parties created public disturbances, traffic hazards, and potential safety risks. They encouraged neighbors to document suspicious activity near my property and report it to the board. Within days, I had retirees standing on ladders with binoculars, pretending to trim hedges while jotting down license plates. Kids biking past the gate shouted, "My mom says you're going to get shut down." One neighbor even approached me while I was unloading barrels. "Listen," he said awkwardly, "I don't have a problem with you. But the board is saying you don't have proper zoning permits for events. If that's true, it could lower everyone's home values." I took a deep breath. You want to see my permits? Fine. Here's the binder. I pulled out the thick folder of documents every vineyard owner guards like treasure. County zoning, health department, fire marshal. Every approval neatly tabbed. I let him flip through it until the color drained from his face. You're completely covered, he admitted. Of course I am, I said. I've been running this place 15 years. If I didn't have the right permits, trust me, the county would have shut me down a decade ago. He looked sheepish. Then why's the board saying? Because control, I interrupted. Because Cynthia can't stand the idea of someone in her orbit she doesn't regulate. Doesn't matter if it's legal or not. What matters is whether she signs off on it. The man nodded slowly. That makes sense. Then he added, almost apologetically, but you know she won't stop, right? She's calling a full neighborhood assembly next week. And there it was, the next twist. Cynthia wasn't satisfied with private skirmishes. She wanted a public showdown. The night of the assembly, I walked into the community hall to find nearly 100 residents packed inside. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of gossip. Cynthia sat at the front with the board, looking like a general about to deliver orders. Someone had filed a formal complaint accusing me of running an illegal commercial event space without proper licensing. Cynthia had just escalated to government level, and that I realized was where the war would get truly interesting. The county inspector showed up on a Tuesday morning, right in the middle of our grape crush. Picture a dozen workers sweating in the sun, grape skins sticking to their arms, forklifts humming, bins stacked like miniature skyscrapers. It was organized chaos, the kind you don't interrupt unless you want to get trampled by a pallet jack. And yet, there he was, buttoned shirt, clipboard in hand, shiny shoes already collecting purple stains. "Mr. Blake?" he called over the din. I wiped my hands on a rag, resisting the urge to laugh. "You picked a fine day to visit. Careful, those shoes might never recover." He tried to smile, but his eyes darted nervously around, like a man who'd rather be inspecting a tidy office cubicle. "We received a complaint that you may be operating events on this property beyond the scope of your permits. I'll need to conduct an inspection." I raised an eyebrow. "Events? You mean people drinking wine at tables? That's called a tasting. Pretty standard in a vineyard." He adjusted his glasses. "The complaint specified large gatherings, amplified music, unlicensed parking accommodations." "Ah," I interrupted. "Sounds like the HOA's Greatest Hits album." The inspector's ears turned pink. He clearly knew the source, but wasn't going to say it out loud. "Regardless, we're obligated to investigate." "Fine." I walked him through the barn, the tasting room, even the outdoor patio where we hosted groups. He measured noise levels, checked emergency exits, photographed permits framed on the wall. Every question he asked, I had a document ready. By the end, he looked more tired than suspicious. "Honestly, Mr. Blake, everything appears compliant. I'll file my report accordingly." I offered him a bottle for his trouble. He declined, ethics policy, but smiled on his way out. Still, the visit wasn't pointless, because while he was inspecting, Cynthia had stationed herself at the end of my driveway with a camera phone, filming like she was directing an exposé for the evening news. She made sure every worker, truck, and guest car was caught on video. When I walked over, she lowered the phone, but didn't stop recording. "Smile," she said. "The community deserves transparency." "Careful," I replied. "Last person who filmed me without permission ended up in my holiday slideshow." She sneered. "This isn't a game. You might have fooled the county once, but we'll keep filing until someone finds a violation." It was then I realized Cynthia wasn't chasing a single win. She was trying to exhaust me. If she couldn't shut me down with one hammer blow, she'd chip away with paper cuts until I bled dry. But I don't bleed easily. So I changed tactics. Instead of playing defense, I decided to expose just how absurd her crusade was. That weekend, I hosted another gathering. Not a party, an open vineyard tour. Free entry, free tastings, live demonstrations of grape crushing. Families came, kids stomped grapes in barrels. Musicians played folk tunes. We had food trucks parked legally with county permits. And of course, I invited the press. The local paper sent a photographer, snapping shots of smiling children and purple-stained feet. A lifestyle blogger wrote about the charm of Community Harvest Day. Even a regional wine magazine dropped by, praising the vineyard for engaging the neighborhood. Cynthia showed up, too, storming in like an uninvited guest at a wedding. She demanded to see permits, waved papers in the air, shouted about bylaws. The photographer caught every second, her finger jabbing, her face contorted, me calmly offering her a glass of water while the crowd stared. By Monday, the photo was everywhere. HOA president crashes Vineyard Harvest Festival. The comments online were brutal. People mocked her for policing grape stomping. Memes sprouted overnight. One had her face photoshopped onto a Roman emperor with the caption, "By decree of the HOA, thou shalt not crush grapes." It would have been funny, except Cynthia doesn't lose gracefully. The very next week, the sheriff himself pulled in my driveway. Sheriff Daniel stepped out, hat tilted back, expression halfway between annoyance and amusement. "Morning," he said. "Got another call from your friends at the HOA. Said you were hosting unlicensed commercial concerts." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the wine thief I was holding. "Concerts? Sheriff, The loudest thing here is the cork popper. Yeah, I figured, he said. But policy's policy. Had to check. Mind if I take a look around? I waved him through. As we walked, workers tipped their hats, guests sipped quietly on the patio, and the only music came from a single violinist practicing under the pergola. Daniels shook his head. This is what they're calling a concert. Apparently, I said. Should I install a mosh pit to match the description? He chuckled. I'll shut this complaint down. But between you and me, Blake, she's getting desperate. You embarrassed her in front of the whole neighborhood. Now she's trying to rope us into her war. I knew he was right, but I also knew desperate people often pull their most reckless moves when cornered. And sure enough, Cynthia found her next weapon, money. 2 weeks later, glossy flyers appeared in every mailbox of the subdivision. Across the top, in bold letters, "Protect our community." Below, a dramatic photo of cars lined along my Vineyard road, captioned, "Uncontrolled events threaten our safety." Neighbors called me, furious. "She wants us to cough up $500 each to sue you," one woman complained. "That's insane." Another said, "I don't even drink wine, but this is ridiculous. We bought houses near a vineyard. What did she expect, a monastery?" The vote was scheduled for the following week. I realized the HOA was about to gamble real money on this feud. If Cynthia won the vote, she'd have cash and legitimacy. If she lost, her grip on the board would crumble. So I decided to raise the stakes. The night before the vote, I hosted a private dinner in the barrel room. Not for distributors or tourists, just for the neighbors. Invitations hand-delivered, tables set between stacks of oak casks, candles flickering against stone walls. I poured my best vintages, served food from chef friend, and kept the tone simple. Good company, good wine, good conversation. No speeches, no hard sell. Just neighbors realizing I wasn't the villain Cynthia painted me to be. By the end of the evening, laughter echoed louder than the violinist, and several folks left hugging bottles as gifts. The next day, the vote failed spectacularly. 70% against. Cynthia's special assessment was dead before it left the cradle. But the defeat didn't humble her. It radicalized her. That evening, I found an envelope taped to my gate. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line typed in bold. "If you won't respect our authority, we'll make you." No signature, but I didn't need one. The HOA had just declared open war. The question now wasn't whether Cynthia would keep escalating. It was how far she'd go before she crossed a line even the sheriff couldn't ignore. And from the look of things, that line was coming fast. The first strike landed at dawn. I woke to the sound of engines grinding up the gravel road and the unmistakable crunch of tires on vines. When I looked out the window, 2 tow trucks were parked at the edge of my lower vineyard, chains rattling as workers in reflective vests hooked them to a row of cars. Not abandoned junkers, my guest cars from a wedding rehearsal dinner the night before. I threw on boots and stormed down the hill. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" One of the drivers barely looked at me. "Got an order from the HOA. These vehicles are parked illegally." I laughed, sharp and cold. "Illegally? They're parked on my land." He shrugged, tightening a chain. "Not my problem. I've got paperwork." He handed me a folded sheet stamped with HOA letterhead. It was a parking enforcement notice citing bylaws about unauthorized roadside obstruction. Of course, the bylaws only applied to HOA-maintained roads. These cars were 30 feet inside my fence line. I tore the paper in half. "Here's your notice. Now unhook those cars before I call the sheriff and have you towed." The driver muttered something under his breath, but one look at the size of Luis, looming behind me with a wrench the size of a baseball bat, convinced him. Chains dropped, trucks reversed, and within minutes they were gone. But the message was clear. Cynthia was willing to drag third parties into her crusade, even if it meant crossing legal boundaries. By noon, I had guests calling in a panic. "We don't want our cars stolen," one said. "Are you sure it's safe to come?" Business depends on confidence, and Cynthia knew it. Fear was her real weapon. I called Sheriff Daniels again. He listened, sighed, and finally said, "All right, Blake. Enough's enough. I'll issue a warning to the HOA. If they try pulling stunts like that again, I'll treat it as trespassing. That gave me some relief, but only briefly, because 2 days later, a manila envelope arrived by certified mail. Inside, a lawsuit. The HOA, led by Cynthia, was suing me for nuisance and diminution of property values. They claimed my Vineyard events created traffic hazards, noise pollution, and safety risks. The kicker? They asked for an injunction to prohibit me from hosting any gatherings exceeding 10 individuals without HOA approval. It was laughable on paper, but lawsuits aren't funny in practice. They drain time, money, and energy, and they scare people who don't know better. Distributors started asking cautious questions again. A restaurant postponed their order. Cynthia's smear campaign was working through sheer persistence. I hired a lawyer, a sharp, sarcastic woman named Dana who chewed through worse cases than mine. She skimmed the complaint and rolled her eyes. This is tissue paper. They can't regulate private agricultural land, but it'll take months to grind through court. In the meantime, they'll drag your name, exactly as Cynthia wanted. Still, I wasn't going to play defense forever. If she wanted war, she'd get war. So I started digging, not into bylaws, not into zoning, but into the HOA itself. And what I found was a gold mine. Turns out Cynthia had been running the board like her personal fiefdom for years. She approved landscaping contracts for her cousin's company at inflated prices. She used HOA funds to pay for consulting services provided by her husband's firm. And the HOA had quietly racked up nearly $80,000 in questionable expenses over 3 years. I didn't leak it immediately. Timing is everything. Instead, I filed a countersuit. If they want a court fine, I dragged them in too. Dana drafted a claim for harassment, tortious interference with business, and malicious abuse of process. The day they were served, Cynthia showed up at my gate, fuming. "You think you can intimidate us with lawsuits?" she spat. "Not intimidate," I said calmly. "Balance the scales. You wanted legal war. Now you've got one." She jabbed a finger toward me. "You're going to regret this. The HOA isn't afraid of you." "Maybe not," I replied. "But I wonder how your members will feel when they see the financial records." For the first time, I saw her flinch. Just a fraction, but enough. That week, I organized another community dinner. This one wasn't about wine or charm. It was about truth. I projected the HOA's expenses on a screen in the barrel room. Landscaping contracts twice the market rate. Payments to consultants that traced back to Cynthia's relatives. Thousands of dollars spent on administrative costs with no receipts. The neighbors murmured, eyes widening. One man stood up and shouted, "Is this where our dues are going?" Another woman demanded, "Why didn't we know about this?" I kept my voice even. "I didn't bring you here to tell you what to think, just to show you facts. If you're happy with how the HOA spend your money, fine. But if not, remember you have the power to vote." The room erupted into heated discussion. Cynthia wasn't there. She never would have walked into that lion's den. But her allies on the board were, and they looked like cornered animals. By the end of the night, a group of residents had drafted a petition to call a recall election. For the first time, Cynthia's throne was wobbling. But wounded leaders are dangerous. 2 nights later, I was sitting on the porch with a glass of Syrah when headlights cut across the vines. A car idled at the gate, then peeled away. I thought nothing of it until I walked the property the next morning. Spray paint covered one of the barn doors. Big, ugly letters, HOA rules or else. I stood there, staring at the red paint dripping down the wood. Not just vandalism, a threat. Luis found me minutes later. "Boss," he said, fists clenched. "You want me to handle it?" I shook my head. "No, let them bury themselves. Every desperate act only proves my point." I called Daniels. He came out, took photos, filed a report. "This is criminal mischief," he said. "If we can tie it back to anyone, they'll face charges. But you and I both know the HOA didn't sign their names to this." "No," I said, "but everyone will assume it anyway. And that's good enough for now." Word spread fast. Guests asked about the graffiti. Neighbors whispered. Suddenly, Cynthia wasn't just the woman fighting a vineyard. She was the woman whose war had spilled into threats and vandalism. And just when I thought things couldn't escalate further, the county clerk called. Mr. Blake, you should know something. We've received a petition from the HOA requesting a zoning review of your entire vineyard operation. If it goes through, you'll be subject to a full audit. Could take months. Of course. Cynthia's last gambit, weaponized bureaucracy. But what she didn't realize was that I had one last card of my own. Because buried deep in county records was a clause almost nobody remembered, except me. Decades ago, when my grandfather purchased the valley, he negotiated a unique designation. Not just agricultural land, not just private property, but a heritage estate, recognized as a protected cultural landmark of the county. And heritage estates don't answer to HOAs. They don't get rezoned on a whim. They carry privileges most developers would kill for. I never flaunted it, never needed to. But now is my ace. But as I scanned the faces, I saw Cynthia standing at the edge, pale and furious, clutching a folder to her chest. And I knew, despite everything, I hadn't seen her last move yet. The night after I revealed the heritage estate designation, the valley felt quieter than usual. Guests had gone, workers had packed up, even the cicadas seemed to hum more softly. I sat on the porch with a glass of Cabernet, savoring the stillness, but I knew it was only a pause. Cynthia wasn't the type to accept checkmate. She'd been embarrassed in front of neighbors, outflanked in court, and stripped of every practical weapon she had. That only left the irrational ones. Sure enough, just before midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from Luis. "Boss, lights by the lower gate." Not ours. I grabbed a flashlight, slipped on boots, and drove down in the ATV. As I crested the hill, beams of headlights cut through the rows of vines. A group of people stood at the gate, flashlights sweeping, voices low but urgent. When I drew closer, I realized it wasn't just random vandals. It was Cynthia and half the board. "What the hell are you doing on my property at midnight?" I called, voice sharp over the engine. Cynthia spun around, startled but defiant. "We're here to document evidence. You staged that so-called heritage estate stunt. We're verifying the validity of your claim." I killed the engine, stepped off, and leveled the flashlight at them. "By trespassing? At night? Do you realize how insane this looks?" One of her board allies, a thin man with glasses fogging in the beam, piped up nervously. We just wanted to see the original boundary markers. To check if your land actually includes the roads." I almost laughed. Boundary markers? At midnight? You could have requested records from the county clerk, like civilized people. Cynthia raised her chin. "We don't trust records you've had years to manipulate." That's when Sheriff Daniel's cruiser rolled up behind them, siren off, but lights flashing red against the vines. He stepped out slowly, hand resting on his belt. "Evening, folks. Care to explain why I'm finding a pack of homeowners playing detective on someone else's land after dark?" Cynthia tried to sound righteous. "Sheriff, we're investigating fraudulent claims. This man is lying to the community." Daniels cut her off with a chuckle. "Ma'am, I saw the original heritage designation myself when my office researched the property line last year. It's legitimate. More legitimate than you standing here with flashlights trespassing at midnight." The board members shifted uncomfortably. One muttered something about miscommunication. Another shuffled papers, as if hoping rules would appear out of thin air. Daniels gestured toward their cars. "You've got two choices. Leave quietly, or I haul you in for trespass tonight." And trust me, explaining that to a judge won't look good on the record. For once, Cynthia didn't argue. She spun on her heel, furious but silent, and the group slunk away. When the dust settled, Daniels looked at me. "You see what I mean, Blake? She's not just fighting you. She's unraveling." He was right. And unraveling people are unpredictable. The next morning, the community buzzed with the story. News travels fast when your HOA president nearly gets arrested on camera. Someone had snapped a photo of the scene, red and blue lights reflecting on the vines. Cynthia, mid-gesture with her folder, clutched her chest. By noon, the photo was on neighborhood forums captioned, "Midnight Raid on the Vineyard." The board fractured almost immediately. 2 members resigned, claiming they'd been misled. Others distanced themselves publicly. Suddenly, Cynthia looked less like a leader and more like a lone crusader. But she wasn't done. 2 days later, every mailbox in the subdivision carried a letter with her signature at the bottom. It accused me of orchestrating a smear campaign, of bribing neighbors with lavish dinners, and of forging documents to claim heritage status. She called me a parasite exploiting community resources for personal gain. The letter dripped with venom, but it also reeked of desperation. People were tired of her. Where once she'd inspired whispers of support, now she inspired rolled eyes. One neighbor even taped the letter to his door with a note, "This week's comedy." But Cynthia's last card wasn't gossip. It was the courtroom. Our hearing date had arrived. The county courthouse was packed the morning of the trial. Not just lawyers and board members, but neighbors, reporters, even a few Vineyard tourists curious to see the drama firsthand. Cynthia strutted in wearing a bright red blazer, expression set like stone. I came in calm, binder of documents under my arm, Dana at my side. The judge opened the session, asking the HOA to present its case. Cynthia launched into a speech about community harmony, standards, safety, and values. She spoke about children in danger from inebriated strangers, about clogged roads, about the erosion of property values from reckless vineyard parties. Her words were polished, but her tone cracked. She sounded less like a leader and more like someone begging not to lose control. Then it was our turn. Dana stood, crisp and direct. She dismantled every claim point by point. County permits approved, noise levels documented under legal limits, parking well within my property lines. Then she dropped the bombshell, the Heritage Estate designation. She held up the original document with the county seal, dated decades earlier. "This land is not subject to HOA jurisdiction," Dana said firmly. "Not now, not ever. The plaintiff's lawsuit has no basis in law. In fact, it borders on harassment." Gasps rippled through the room. Even the judge raised an eyebrow. He took the document, studied it, and nodded slowly. Cynthia rose, shouting, "Forgery!" He faked it. The judge cut her off. "Enough, Mrs. Holloway. This document is county certified. Unless you have evidence of fraud, this court accepts its legitimacy." She faltered, speechless. For the first time in months, Cynthia had no words. The judge ruled swiftly. The lawsuit dismissed. The HOA warned against further frivolous filings, and costs awarded to me. The courtroom erupted. Neighbors clapped. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even some board members hugged me on the way out. Cynthia stormed off, her red blazer vanishing into the crowd like a retreating flag. Victory tasted sweeter than any vintage. But it wasn't just about winning, it was about survival. For months, she tried to crush me with rules, gossip, and intimidation. And now the law itself had sided with me. That evening, the Vineyard threw an impromptu celebration. Workers opened barrels, neighbors brought food, musicians played on the patio. The valley glowed with laughter and light. For once, everyone felt free, not policed, not threatened, just alive. Halfway through the night, Sheriff Daniels raised a glass. "To Blake," he said, "the only man I know who can turn a vineyard into a battlefield and still make it taste like victory." The HOA had tried everything to strip me of control. In the end, all they'd done was remind the entire community who really owned this valley. And that, I decided, was the sweetest victory of all.